We need a clever plan. What would de Botton do? An evil Alain de Botton?
We should all be Marxists.
Oh, evil Alain de Botton. Why are you promoting Marxism?
At this point in history, we should all be Marxists, in the sense of agreeing with his diagnosis of our troubles.
All right, Alan, I guess that seemed quite measured and reasonable. But it still does seem a bit strange to defend a political philosophy responsible for so much suffering in the 20th century. I mean, just look how awkward Jeremy Corbyn is about it.
Do you regard yourself as a Marxist?
That's a very interesting question, actually.
And it's almost impossible to defend in America.
Sounds like socialism to me!
That being said, it does seem like socialism is becoming more popular, especially amongst young people, with sales of the work of Karl Marx going through the roof. At the same time, however, people are paying more and more attention to the catastrophic failings of the state of Venezuela, which has explicitly based itself on Marxist principles for many years now. Now, some commentators have put this down to bad luck or bad management, which I suppose is true, but it's also worth asking whether there are core principles at the heart of Marxism that reliably bring about terrible, terrible outcomes. So the question I want to try to answer today is to what extent Marx's ideas are actually responsible for these awful outcomes, as opposed to merely bad implementation or poor leadership. So to do this, we're going to break down Marxism into its three main components. The first is the idea of exploitation. Take it away, Alain.
Marx insists that at its crudest, capitalism means paying a worker one price for doing something and then selling it to somebody else at a much higher price. Profit is the fancy term for exploitation.
So what Marx is claiming here is that as a worker, you're going to tend to receive less value in wages than what you contributed by your labour. This extra value is captured by the capitalist and is what constitutes profit. Now the problem is, to make this claim, you need some way of measuring what the value is that a worker contributes. And you need to show that this value is greater than the sum of money that the worker gets paid. To do this, Marx relied on the labour theory of value, which is a very old theory in economics which no one really believes anymore. This is because the labour theory of value claimed that the value of a good or a service was derived from the hours of labour that went into it. So for example, the reason a brand new car is so expensive is because it takes many hours of labour to produce. Now it's true that a very valuable good usually takes many hours of labour to create. But what the labour theory of value gets wrong is that the value of a good can't be derived from how much labour went into it. The value of a good is determined by its usefulness and by its scarcity, how much of it is there. Thus in economics we talk about demand and supply. You can easily imagine a good that took hours and hours and hours to produce, but suddenly has no value because there are much better alternatives. Conversely, you can imagine a good that took very little labour to produce, but suddenly becomes extremely valuable. So the question is this: if the labour theory of value is not taken seriously by most economists, why is it still so appealing to Marxists? The reason is that it seems to offer a rationale for paying workers and labourers more and managers and owners less. These days CEOs can earn many times more than their workers, and this seems unfair if we're just looking at the hours of labour they're putting in. And the labour theory of value seems to say that if you're working just as hard for as many hours, you should be contributing the same amount of value, and thus should be paid the same. This leads us to the really attractive and intuitive idea in Marxism that if all contributors to a final good or service, such as workers, CEOs, managers, whoever, are all equally necessary for the creation of that good, they all should be paid the same. Now, it's true to say that all the workers in the world are just as valuable as all the CEOs and owners. But this fact actually isn't relevant when deciding what someone ought to be paid for a specific role. After all, an owner doesn't employ all the workers in the world, they're just hiring one. When you're hiring a labourer, there's usually a large pool of people that can do that job. But when hiring a CEO, there might only be a handful of people in the world who can do that job. This is what determines the specific value of individual roles, the employee's usefulness, and how many there are who can also do that role. So CEOs generally earn a lot more because there are far fewer people with the required skills to compete against. So this explains why the value of someone's contribution cannot simply be reduced to the hours of labour they put in, which is the basis for the labour theory of value. Without the labour theory of value, Marx's idea of exploitation doesn't make any sense. So let's move on to the second main principle of Marxism. This is a principle about methodology called conflict theory. This basically says that society is made up of different classes of people, like workers and capitalists, and each class has their own class interest. The The idea is that by using this assumption, we can model society scientifically. Here's Ollie from Philosophy Tube to explain.
A little bit like in meteorology. When we look at a weather front, we know that not every molecule of air has the same temperature and moves in the same direction, but we can observe trends in groups of them and model those trends. Marx thought that we could model class conflict so accurately we could even predict the future with it. He thought that society would follow an inevitable progress towards communism.
What in heaven's name are you talking about?
Human beings are not like droplets of rain. We don't just mindlessly follow deterministic patterns of behaviour. We all have particular desires and beliefs, and we change those beliefs as we go through life and learn. We are, as they say, autonomous. Now, with a deterministic system, like for example a river, you can reliably change its behaviour with a simple intervention, like redirecting a river's flow, for example. But people do not work like this. When you introduce a new law into a society, the behaviour of people in that society depends on what they think of the law. That is, laws don't directly cause people to obey them. What they do is set up certain incentives. They can punish you for not obeying them, and they can reward you for obeying them. But if people really don't want to obey it, they're not going to. A classic example is the Prohibition era in the United States, where people just kept on drinking. Now, a law especially won't be followed if it seems irrational or unfair. In other words, they'll need to be coerced by a large police force into obeying the laws. The point is this: if you assume that the fundamental units of your society are classes like capitalists and workers, two things are going to happen. Firstly, you're probably not going to take into account the effect your laws are going to have on individual people, and so your system will probably have huge unintended negative consequences for them. Secondly, in reducing someone to the class that they belong to, you'll probably influence them to identify strongly with that class and think in terms of the interests of that class and not the interests of society as a whole. This is how historically Marx's ideas have actually fomented class warfare, by making people identify with a specific class rather than as individual human beings. As Marx said, up until now the philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point is to change it. Well, Marx's ideas definitely did change the world. They led to the purging of those that didn't belong to the right class in Soviet Russia, and similar atrocities in Mao's China. This brings us to the third and final component of Marxism, which is the idea of alienation. Under capitalism, there's a strong tendency towards specialization. This is because if you break down a complex task into components and you get individuals to become experts at doing those components, this is far more efficient than having everyone be an expert at everything. Marx's claim was that this process alienates a worker from the product of their labour.
Alienation. It's this idea that by working for someone else, you lose control over your own life, your own destiny, if you like. You lose a bit of your own humanity.
A worker in a factory doesn't have the same connection to the final product as an artisan might have towards a product that they've created with their bare hands. Now, this is a fair point, but Marx's solution is hardly better. You could get rid of private property and provide resources to every individual to do exactly what they wanted and create exactly what they wanted to create, but don't expect everyone's quality of life to remain the same. Without mass specialization, you wouldn't have products like the iPhone, or almost any other good or service that's typical of a modern society. But it's not just that you have more wealth under a capitalist system. You're actually not alienated from your labour in the way that Marx describes. The reason people take on menial, mundane jobs, crafting something they're not interested in, is because that option offers them more money than if they did anything else. If you want to create and sell something entirely by yourself in capitalism, you can. You'll probably fail because you're unlikely to be awesome at all of the things required to make a great good or service. You'll probably need to cooperate with lots of other people, which brings you right back to specialization. Similarly, you might not be able to afford to go out on a venture of your own, and that's why we have the industry of finance. You can borrow money if someone else thinks that your venture is worthwhile. So the question is, if people are free to do all of this, what do Marxists actually want? It seems to reduce to the idea that other people are coerced through the government to pay them to do exactly what they want to do. Now, I could be wrong here, but this sounds a little like exploitation to me. And it could go a long way in explaining the actual exploitation that occurred in every existing Marxist state. So, to sum up, you can break down Marxism into three main parts: exploitation, conflict theory, and alienation. Marx's theory of exploitation legitimates theft, and it goes a long way to explaining why there was massive coercive redistribution in Marxist states. The second main idea is that of conflict theory, which dehumanizes individuals into specific classes. which in turn foments class conflict and unjust laws. The final idea is that of alienation, which is the idea that you should be able to do whatever you want to do, whenever you want to do, regardless of how much it costs others. As I said, this seems kind of selfish. So when you add up all these components, you get a theory that seems fundamentally incoherent. And the only way to implement incoherent ideas on an otherwise rational population is via massive coercion and a totalitarian police state.